Ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening and a very warm welcome to Durham Cathedral. My name is Simon Oliver. I'm Professor of Theology at Durham University and one of the residentiary canons here at the Cathedral. Before we begin this evening's lecture, I'd like to say a few words about our context. This is the inaugural event of the Durham Cathedral Institute. The Institute's a new initiative to open the doors of the Cathedral for public debate and discussion around the most important moral, political and spiritual issues of our time. We'll be inviting speakers from all over the country to discuss issues that affect us all. So later this year we're planning a panel debate on levelling up, another on the future of secondary education, and early next year on the future of healthcare as we learn to live with COVID. And those events, those panel debates are going to be supplemented by occasional lectures and talks, the first of those lectures being this evening. So we really do look forward to welcoming you back to the Cathedral in the future for these Durham Cathedral Institute events. Just a few practical matters before we begin. After Bridget Kendall's lecture, we're going to have a question and answer session, and there are two ways in which you can ask a question. You were given a slip on the way into the Cathedral this evening. On there is a QR code. If you scan the QR code with your phone, it will take you straight to an app. There's nothing to download. It will take you to an app where you can type in your question and your name if you'd like to, and it will magically appear here on the Dean's tablet. That's the easiest way. We'd rather you didn't get so fixed on the app that you stopped listening to the lecture. But that's the easiest way of asking a question. Please do use that at any time during the lecture as a question occurs to you. And questions that are made public you'll also be able to see on your app and vote up the ones you like and down the ones you don't like. There we go. We're nothing if not cutting-edge technology here at Durham Cathedral. The second way you can ask a question, which I would much prefer, is to use a pen and paper. Take the slip of paper, turn it over, it's blank, use a pen, write your question, hold it up, and one of the stewards will come and collect it from you and bring it up to the front here. I hope that's okay and clear for the question and answer. We're gathered here this evening to reflect and to learn about the tragic war in Ukraine. This lecture is the culmination of a day of prayer in the Cathedral, prayer for all who suffer because of this terrible war. Obviously the people in Ukraine, but also the people of Russia who do not enjoy a free political process and a free press. This lecture comes at the beginning of Holy Week, when we look towards Christ's passion and crucifixion and the hope of the resurrection. So before I hand over to the Dean to welcome this evening's speaker, can I invite you to stand as we keep a moment of silence as we reflect on this conflict. We offer up our yearning for peace to Almighty God, and we will end with the Church's special prayer, the Collect for Good Friday. Almighty Father, look with mercy on this your family, for which our Lord Jesus Christ was content to be betrayed and given up into the hands of sinners and to suffer death upon the cross, who is alive and glorified with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. Thank you very much. Please do be seated as I hand over to the Dean.
Simon, thank you very much, and can I take this opportunity of thanking you for your leadership with others of the new Institute for the Cathedral. On the platform this evening, we welcome two highly distinguished individuals who contribute to our national conversation. The Right Reverend Paul Butler was appointed Bishop of Durham in 2014. Paul's ministry over 40 years has championed the place of children and young people in society, and he speaks regularly in the House of Lords on child poverty. This time last week, Paul was in Parliament speaking against the government proposals in the Nationality and Borders Bill. Paul will be offering a first response to our lecture this evening. Before joining Peterhouse as its first female master in 2016, Bridget Kendall spent over 30 years working for the BBC. She began as a graduate trainee in 1983 and became one of the corporation's most respected international correspondents. She was BBC Moscow correspondent from 1989 to 1994, covering the final years of the Soviet Union and the first years of the post-Soviet Russia. She was BBC Washington correspondent from 94 to 98 during the Clinton presidency. From 1998 to 2016, she held the senior role of BBC diplomatic correspondent, reporting on major global trends and crises. Of particular note for tonight's lecture, of course, she conducted 2 long interviews with President Vladimir Putin in 2001 and 2006, both broadcast live to the world from inside the Kremlin. Bridget read modern languages at Lady Margaret Hall in Oxford, pursued Soviet studies at St Anthony's College in Oxford, and spent 2 years in Moscow and Voronezh State Universities on British Council scholarships, and 2 years at Harvard on a Harkness Fellowship. Following her election as Master in 2016, she was appointed a Deputy Vice-Chancellor of the University of Cambridge in 2020. She now chairs the Management Committee for the University's Centre for Geopolitics. So please would you join me in welcoming warmly this evening our lecturer, Bridget Kendall.
Good evening, everyone. And may I start with thank yous. Thank you to Andrew for your kind introduction, and also to Simon Oliver for inviting me and for organising my visit here today. When I was invited by Durham Cathedral to give a lecture about what's been happening in Ukraine, I knew it wouldn't be an easy task. But I didn't realise quite how hard it would be for me to dwell on the terrible events that have been unfolding in the last few weeks and to delve into my thoughts on them. For any of us, it's always upsetting to hear about the brutality of any war, and the horror of what's been happening in Ukraine is particularly shocking. For me, the grief I feel is almost too much to admit to myself. It tears me up inside. I've spent all my adult life involved in this part of the world one way or another, ever since I first went to Russia and to Ukraine when I was a teenager. I had always believed and hoped that life there would get better for people, not descend into mayhem. Yet if I find this horror almost too much to bear, how much worse must it be for those caught up in the conflict? Those Ukrainians desperately fighting to defend their country, those forced to flee, their lives shattered, and those watching friends and family die next to them while they survived. I keep thinking, this is not the first time that many of these towns and villages have been laid to waste by an invading army. Within living memory, it's happened before. Some 80 years ago, when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, Ukraine was in the path of the Nazi German army sweeping eastwards. Some older Ukrainians still remember it. One elderly resident of Bucha, who survived the recent massacre there, noted, "Last time it was the Nazis invading from the west. This time it was the Russians invading from the east. The only difference was that this time I could understand them because they were speaking Russian." What I find even more disturbing is that on the Eastern Front in World War II, it wasn't just the Ukrainians and the Belarusians who suffered. Russians, too, were victims of the Nazi invasion. The devastation caused by the Battle of Stalingrad is well known, but many other places all over Western and Southern Russia were also devastated by the German advance. The provincial city of Voronezh, not far from the Ukrainian border, where I spent a year as a student in the mid-1970s, was largely destroyed by the German army. It had to be completely rebuilt. In the mid-1970s, when I was there, everyone in Voronezh still vividly recalled that invasion. "Let there be no more war," was the constant refrain. So I asked myself, how could any Russian who knew what the Nazi invasion did to their country not look with horror and aversion at what is happening to Ukraine today? And how Russians are reacting is an important question, and something I'll come back to in a minute. For those Russians who still dare speak out to denounce their own government's actions in Ukraine, there are disturbing historical echoes. This post on Twitter a few days ago was from Leonid Grozman, a former opposition politician, still in Moscow. "No one since Stalin has delivered such a blow to Russia as Putin has. Now we understand what feelings the Germans, people like us, must have had about the Third Reich. Lord, when will this nightmare end?" My own involvement in this part of the world goes back many decades to when I was a student studying Russian, and it has continued to this day. Up until I left the BBC to become Master of a Cambridge college in 2016, I was a regular visitor to Russia, making trips there sometimes several times a year, and the odd visit to Ukraine as well. As I said earlier, I spent the mid-1970s a year in Voronezh in southern Russia, which isn't far from the Ukrainian border, studying and travelling. My first visits to Kiev and Odessa in Ukraine date from then. I spent another year as a student in Moscow in the last year of Brezhnev's rule, 1981 to 82. And when I joined the BBC in 1983, and when the Soviet Union began to open up under Mikhail Gorbachev's perestroika reforms, I started to visit frequently as a journalist, making a point of travelling to most Soviet republics, including Ukraine, as well as far-flung parts of Russia. In 1989, as you heard from Dean, the BBC asked me to move to Moscow full-time and be based there as BBC Moscow correspondent, which I did for 5 years, just in time to see the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe disintegrate, and after it, the Soviet Union itself implode. I was still there until 1994, reporting on the new independent countries emerging from the ashes of what had been a communist, totalitarian Soviet state. Among them, of course, Boris Yeltsin's post-Soviet Russia and the newly independent state of Ukraine. Those were heady days to be a journalist. It was a time of excitement and extraordinary hope. The Soviet communist empire, which had for so long seemed so repressive and so indestructible, had suddenly fragmented. And with that breakup, 4 decades of Cold War divisions and tensions ended, bringing new possibilities of peace and prosperity to the whole world. For many former citizens of the Soviet Union, it was exhilarating. Like me, many of them had never thought that the Soviet communist rule would end in their lifetime. The bureaucratic machine that kept it in place seemed so deeply entrenched, we assumed it would be there for decades to come. And now suddenly, there was a chance for each former Soviet republic to forge an independent national identity, and for each individual person to shape a better future for themselves and for their children. For the first time in their lives, they had the freedom to choose their own employment, create their own business, express themselves without fear of retribution, and, if they had the money and the means, explore the rest of the world. Of course, that euphoria didn't last. We now know that the revolutions of 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, and 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, ushered in a new era of peace which was more fragile than it first appeared. I suspect that I'm not alone in wondering now if we were naive. Should we not have been more cautious and wary? Now we see how easy it proved to be to turn the clock back to war, repression, and a divided world. It's true that from the start, back then in the late 80s and early 90s, there were grumblings in Russia. Alongside the jubilation, those who'd been in the Soviet military and security services, those who'd been lifelong communist believers, quietly resented the end of Soviet rule. Vladimir Putin, it seems, was among them. It's also true that when the initial excitement wore off, there was plenty of dismay and trepidation among everyone in Russia, who found that managing to survive in the post-Soviet world was much more precarious and stressful than they'd imagined. The end of communism might have brought more freedoms and less state control. The queues may have gone, as the empty shelves in the state shops gave way to new supermarkets laden with abundance. But Russia's new market economy was also terrifying. It felt as though the state, once so stultifying and controlling, had abandoned its citizens, leaving them exposed to a new world of escalating prices, joblessness, bankruptcy, and debt, with no social safety net and very little by the way of rule of law. And meanwhile, other Russians, the new rich, as they were known, were amassing fortunes for themselves and their relatives, either by cleverly navigating the new system and chaos of those early years, or by ruthlessly manipulating and stealing to enrich themselves. Two sides of the same coin, often. Before long, that mounting resentment evolved into a new Russian nationalism, tinged with hostility towards the West in particular. In the view of these new nationalists, Russia had got little in return for dissolving its empire, except to lose influence, territory, status, and most importantly, the security guarantees which the Cold War had codified for so long. One by one, former Soviet allies in Europe opted to join NATO, and then parts of the old Soviet Union, and the former cordon sanitaire on Russia's outer rim that had been a buffer zone against potential foreign enemies began to disappear. I should stress that this sense of grievance against NATO among Russians did not at first look like a mainstream view. In the 1990s, when I was still correspondent there, I remember it was a refrain confined to armchair generals and extremist fringe groups. Plenty of other Russians saw the West not as a problem, but part of the solution. It was a destination that had been denied to them for too long, a partner that they would like to collaborate with, a model of stability, prosperity, and democratic accountability that they desperately wanted for their country too. But NATO's attack on Serbia over its actions in Kosovo in 1999, overriding Russian concerns at the UN Security Council, rankled with many. And before long, those who harboured brooding resentments would find a champion in their new president, the ex-KGB operative, Vladimir Putin. His ascent to power would prove a turning point for Russia. From the moment he became president in 2000, he made clear his ambition was to raise Russia up from its knees and turn it back into a power that could not be ignored. He made calculated overtures to the West to see if it was prepared to be a partner on his terms, but he also began building an alternative narrative, a case for why NATO, and the United States in particular, should be seen as Russia's existential enemy, a threat to its security and even to its very existence. Even so, I have to admit that for myself, as the years of Vladimir Putin's rule wore on, however much he complained about NATO, I never thought he would launch Russia into an outright war on the scale of what we're seeing today. Even after his incursion into Georgia in the Caucasus in 2008, and even after his troops seized Crimea from Ukraine in 2014, and he warned the West that there was no international rule book anymore and the gloves were off and the Russian bear's sharp claws were out, I didn't think he would risk everything in a military escapade with consequences that he couldn't control. I never thought that he and those around him would take the fateful step to launch an outright destructive and bloody war on Ukraine, by far Russia's most important and once its closest neighbour. Now, many Ukrainians will tell you that they have been victims of aggression from Russia throughout history, that they were subjected to rule from medieval Muscovy, then by the Russian Tsarist emperors, and then in the 20th century became victims of ruthless repression by the Soviet Communist government, including the horrific famine of the Stalin era when it's thought that millions of Ukrainians died of starvation. Against this background, Ukrainians argue, it should have come as no surprise that the Russian president first seized the Crimean Peninsula and took control of 2 small enclaves in eastern Ukraine in 2014, and that he should now have embarked on a full-scale attack on Ukraine. But I must confess that, like many other Russian experts, I didn't see it coming. Yes, ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, there have been tensions over Ukraine's status vis-à-vis Russia, and especially over the status of Crimea, where the Russian Navy's Black Sea Fleet is based. But I always thought Putin would refrain from going the whole way, for the same reason that it seemed he held back from advancing on Kiev when he seized Crimea, because it was too risky. There are numerous arguments for why it looked like a bad idea. In the first place, you can't get away from the many common bonds between Russians and Ukrainians. They're both Slavic peoples, linked by similar languages, religious ties, and many family interconnections. I think it's fair to say that every Russian person I know has close family or friends in Ukraine. So I just couldn't fathom how the Kremlin would explain to the Russian people what justified shedding Russian and Ukrainian blood in a ground attack on their Ukrainian Slav brothers. Secondly, the traditional Russian view of war is that it's always about defending Mother Russia, not intervening in other lands. Russian politicians have always been keen to labour this point. Russians have protected their countries from invasions for centuries, they argue, from attacks by the Swedes, by Napoleon, by Hitler. But Russia, they insist, is not an aggressive nation. It doesn't use its might to attack another country unprovoked. Thirdly, although Vladimir Putin likes to claim that Ukraine doesn't really exist and that part of it at least should be absorbed into a greater Russian-speaking world, in the 30 years since the Soviet Union fell apart, it's become patently clear that, whatever Mr. Putin would like to be the case, there is now a very strong Ukrainian national identity, which encompasses the whole country. Perhaps back in 1991, the concept of a border between Russia and Ukraine may have looked theoretical, especially when in eastern Ukrainian villages many people spoke Russian as their mother tongue, and borders between Soviet republics existed in name only. But 30 years on, there's now a very clear dividing line. And what's more, it's partly due to Mr. Putin's own actions that a Ukrainian sense of separateness has sharpened. When in the winter of 2006 he cut off gas supplies to Ukraine, the impact was felt by all Ukrainians. He may have done it to punish the Kiev government for pivoting away from Russia towards the west, but when he turned off the gas taps, every Ukrainian shivered, including Russian speakers in the east. And Putin's decision to pursue the low-level conflict in support of separatists in eastern Ukraine from 2014 onwards also reinforced Ukrainian convictions that Russia represented a hostile force. No Ukrainian family whose young men were called up to fight or who lost loved ones in that war in the east can see Russia as anything but a threat. And fourthly, while in 2014 the Ukrainian army may have looked weak and ill-equipped, 8 years on, that's no longer the case. I remember in 2014, after Russia seized Crimea, one senior Russian diplomat confidently told me that if Moscow wanted to, it could easily sweep across the country and capture Kiev with little resistance. That may have been wishful thinking then. After all, Mr. Putin decided not to do it. But if he thought it was too risky in 2014, why would he do it now, with the Ukrainian army battle-hardened, better trained and supplied? So the question is, what did push Mr. Putin into taking the drastic step of ordering an invasion of Ukraine? Well, the obvious answer seems to be his brewing resentment and impatience with Ukraine and with its Western supporters that's been building up over 20 years. Everything that's happened, he's seen through the prism of assuming the West wants to deny Russia its rightful place in the world as a strong and equal power, and deny it the right he claims it should have to control countries on its borders. And he also, increasingly, it appears, has seen that the threat is not just to Russia's borders, but to its core, and that the West wants regime change in Russia. But I think there are some other factors we should also take into account. There's President Putin's view of Russian history, for instance. Every Russian schoolchild is taught that Kievan Rus was where the idea of Russian Christianity was born 1,000 years ago, when Prince Vladimir of Kiev converted to Christianity. Mr. Putin's apparent obsession with this may in part, I think, have been driven by a personal mission to cement his place in Russian history as the leader who brought back into Moscow's orbit the original cradle of the Russian nation and the birthplace of Russian orthodoxy, including the ancient gold domes of Santa Sofia Cathedral and the monastery complex in the heart of Kiev. Then there's the Kremlin's security concerns. Every time there's been a crisis in Russian-Ukrainian relations in the last 20 years, it's always been about the Kiev government distancing itself from Russia and orientating itself more towards the West. First, there was the Orange Revolution of 2004 and 5, when Ukrainians protested about Russia's attempts to insert their preferred candidate as president. Then in 2013, when Ukraine defied Russia to seek a closer association with the EU, led to the blow-up through which they lost the Crimea. And now here we are in 2022. And the Kremlin saying that Ukraine has become nothing else than a NATO proxy. But the irony is that every time Russia, Mr. Putin, tries to put pressure on Ukraine, the more Ukraine reaches out to the West for support. If the point of this invasion was to prevent Ukraine from forging closer links with Western powers, it's done the opposite. NATO membership may not be on the cards, but a lot of NATO weaponry is making its way to Ukraine, and Ukraine's application to join the European Union is now actively being considered. And Mr. Putin's attempt to deter NATO from enlarging itself further also looks as though it might backfire. The defence umbrella that NATO offers now has great appeal when you think you've got a belligerent Russian bear on your border. 2 more countries are actively considering abandoning their long-held neutral status to join NATO, Finland and Sweden. Exactly the reverse of what Mr. Putin hoped to achieve. But when you think about all this, you have to remember that perhaps the biggest concern for Mr. Putin is not foreign policy at all, whatever he says, but his hold on power at home. For years, those in Russia who oppose him have been telling us that to understand Mr. Putin's motivation, you have to recognise his worry about potential domestic challenges to his own leadership. And let's not forget what the last 12 months must have looked like to him. Last summer, in neighbouring Belarus, his ally President Lukashenko faced weeks of protesters taking to the streets, seeking to topple him. And at the same time, in the far eastern part of Russia, in Khabarovsk, there were crowds gathering on a weekly basis to challenge the decision taken by Mr. Putin to get rid of a popular government. A really unusual instance of sustained protests inside Russia. Now, when there are protests like this, Vladimir Putin's usual response is to bide his time, wait for the publicity around the protest to subside and the momentum to disappear, and then he cracks down hard on the ringleaders and ratchets up internal control. Because what he does not want to tolerate is any dissent. In his view, there is never any really genuine grassroots dissatisfaction. Protest movements are always fabricated, with the strings pulled or people bought by external powers or internal traitors working for foreigners. The Russian defence doctrine even has a word for such uprisings, coloured revolutions it calls them, allegedly devised and manipulated by hostile external powers who seek to weaken a regime from within. Whether in Egypt, Libya or Syria in the so-called Arab Spring, or closer to home last summer in Belarus, or any large-scale protests in Russia itself. And this is the reason why, if you look back over the last 10 years or so, Mr. Putin has introduced laws which, step by step, have tightened restrictions on free speech and any civic activism which was not sponsored by the state. So first of all, there was a law labelling as a foreign agent any group which received funding or other support from abroad. Then new Russian laws made it treasonous to voice any criticism of the government or the armed forces. More recently, in the last few weeks, it's become illegal to describe the current invasion of Ukraine as a war. You have to call it instead a special operation. And now, just in the last few days, there's a new law in Russia which makes it illegal to promote so-called fake news about the Russian armed forces, a catch-all concept making it easier to arrest even more people. So what is Mr. Putin afraid of here? Well, his internal critics say if Ukraine were to succeed in becoming a stable, prosperous, genuine democracy on a European model, then Russians across the border might want that too. And then a groundswell of discontent inside Russia might become too widespread for the Kremlin to suppress. That, they say, is why Mr. Putin wants Ukraine to fail, even if it means destroying it in the process. There is, I think, a final reason why Mr. Putin acted as he did, and it's about the sort of person he is. A risk-taker, a leader with little concern for human life who's prepared to act ruthlessly if need be to get his way. A man with a long track record of overseeing brutal actions by Russian armed forces which have resulted in civilian deaths which, with more care, could have been avoided. There was Putin's war in Chechnya, which by 2003 had turned the capital, Grozny, into the most destroyed city on earth, according to the United Nations. There was the Moscow theatre siege by armed Chechen terrorists in 2002, which ended when Russian special forces stormed the theatre, so they solved the siege, but they didn't just kill the Chechen terrorists. Dozens of innocent hostages died in the process too. And similarly, in 2004, another siege by Chechen terrorists, this time in southern Russia in a school in Beslan. That too ended when Russian troops stormed the building. They killed the perpetrators, but it also led to the deaths of over 300 people, 180 of them children. And then, in 2016, there was Russia's month-long aerial bombardment of the Syrian city of Aleppo, which it's thought killed more than 440 civilians, among them more than 90 children. And then beyond that, when we look back, we can now see there have also been the many assassinations and poisonings, both in Russia and abroad, which appear to have been part of a chilling and systematic campaign to silence Kremlin critics or intimidate others, so that they would understand that wherever you are in the world, if you oppose the Russian president, you are not safe. I've had occasion to interview Mr. Putin twice, as you heard, and besides that, I've met him several times over a period of years. I always saw him as hard-headed and hard-hearted, but I also thought he was a pragmatist. He was always convinced in the righteousness of his cause and had a deep-seated conviction that Russia had not been treated properly by the outside world. And he definitely did not like being challenged if he could not have the last word. But in the early years of his rule, he also seemed keen to engage with foreigners, to try to win them over to his way of thinking. And while he seemed in some ways impetuous, a risk-taker, he also seemed to be someone capable of recalibrating, of going so far but no further if the risk was too great, or if he could see advantage in changing tack. I think something changed in him around the year 2011 to 2012, when he resumed his position as president after 4 years as prime minister. Part of the change may well have come from his evident consternation at the mass protests against him that sprang up seemingly out of nowhere in several Russian cities at the end of 2011. As usual, he blamed them on foreign powers, but they seemed to shake him greatly. And after that, he seemed increasingly suspicious of Western intentions and far less willing to tolerate any criticism at home. And the official propaganda became even more urgent, to tell Russians to prepare to defend the motherland against a hostile enemy who was seeking to undermine Russia from without and through traitors from within. But I have to say, despite his deepening paranoia and warmongering, I still did not think he would translate his rhetoric into what seemed an incredible act of folly: to invade Ukraine. Now, obviously, on one level, I was wrong. He was prepared to order an attack. But on the other hand, maybe I was also in some ways right. At least, from what we've seen so far, stage one of his invasion does look like an act of folly and a monumental miscalculation. For a start, he assumed the West was weak, distracted, and divided. He had noted President Obama's failure to act decisively over Syria, in contrast to Russia's own Syrian campaign, which in his eyes was a military triumph. He'd observed President Biden's calamitous pullout from Afghanistan last year, and he had surveyed what he thought was a damaged and divided Europe and assumed it would always hold back from the toughest of sanctions against Russia because of its energy needs. Instead, Western sanctions have been far more cohesive and damaging than he probably imagined, inflicting real pain on the Russian economy. Secondly, there seems to have been a stunning Russian intelligence failure underpinning the initial invasion. It appears the plan was to take the capital in a matter of days, remove the Ukrainian leadership, and rely on some sort of Ukrainian welcoming party to install a compliant new pro-Russian leader, as happened in Crimea in 2014. As we know, nothing could have been further from the truth. There was no welcoming party, and Ukrainian resistance was far more effective than the Kremlin expected. And even if his troops had succeeded in occupying Ukraine, how were they to hold such large swathes of territory against a hostile population of some 40 million people? Did Mr. Putin really think that Russian speakers in Ukraine would welcome being shelled by Russia and then agree to collaborate? What we're also learning is that part of the miscalculation was not only the resistance Russian troops encountered, but also their own military weaknesses. The famed might of the Russian armed forces turned out to be an over-optimistic picture. Yes, President Putin had built up the armed forces from 2008 onwards after years of neglect. Yes, he'd poured money into military budgets and ordered troops to conduct constant readiness exercises. But to what avail? When tested on the battlefield over the past few weeks, the Russian war machine has so far looked slow and cumbersome next to the agility and asymmetrical ingenuity of the Ukrainians. Part of the problem the Russian forces faced, it seems, was the unexpectedness of the invasion. In the run-up to the attack at the end of February, bizarrely, it was US and UK intelligence sources that alerted us to what was to come. They repeatedly warned that they had sources which suggested a Russian invasion of Ukraine was a distinct possibility. But ironically, it seems that not only did Western commentators like me dismiss these CIA and MI6 revelations as unlikely, so did many Russian officials in Moscow. Like many of us in the West, they too assumed the massive build-up of Russian troops on the Ukrainian border was just saber-rattling and posturing. On the eve of the invasion, the shocked faces of senior Russian officials paraded by Mr. Putin at an impromptu question and answer session in front of the TV cameras in Moscow suggested they too had been caught unawares by the plan he was about to execute. And we know from testimonies from Russian foot soldiers that many of them had no idea they were about to cross over into Ukrainian territory and go to war. They thought they were just on another training exercise. No surprise then that this lack of preparedness came at a cost, with troops poorly supplied with fuel and food and even information. No wonder then that what has filtered through to the outside world are constant stories of extraordinary low levels of morale, of Russian military vehicles abandoned on highways and in fields, of Russian soldiers even looking for Ukrainian bullets to shoot themselves in the foot so they could claim they were wounded by the enemy and could go home, of one unit so enraged by the orders of their commander, allegedly, that they even ran him over with a tank, and of Russians who were captured or maybe simply gave themselves up to the Ukrainians, either because their abandoned vehicles ran out of fuel or because they didn't have the stomach to fight in a war they had never been prepared for. So where are we now? Well, one outcome has been for the Russian military to announce a change of plan. Russian troops who were trying to encircle Kiev have, says Moscow, served their purpose, and the battle mission has been reframed. It's no longer to remove the Ukrainian leadership and take the capital, but simply liberate the Donbass, the predominantly Russian-speaking part of Ukraine in the east, closer to the Russian border. So, north of Kiev, after weeks of a stalled advance, bogged down in mud and in traffic jams along roads, sitting targets for Ukrainians to pick off, a withdrawal was ordered. Reportedly, some 24,000 Russian troops have been pulled back across the border. Estimates of Russian military casualties run from 7,000 to over 17,000, including several military commanders killed in action, with many thousands more wounded. There are rumours that some Russian soldiers retreating from Ukraine are rebelling against the idea of being sent back in again. Others, as we know, as they retreated, left devastation in their wake, evidence of war crimes and other brutality. Was this wild revenge from undisciplined troops out of control, or a deliberate Russian government ploy to sow fear among the Ukrainian civilian population? Either way, it's prompted the Ukrainian authorities to ask those in eastern regions to evacuate their homes, to reduce the number of civilian targets in the battles to come. But we have to recognise too that if the north has so far looked like a disaster for Russia militarily, it seems their campaign in the south and east of Ukraine has been somewhat more successful. More territory has been taken, though not always successfully held. Perhaps the Russian troops coming up from the Crimea were better trained and equipped and more disciplined. At any rate, it now looks as though the Russian plan in the south and east is to take as much of Ukraine's Black Sea coastline as possible, both to disable Ukraine economically by cutting off its sea trading routes, and to create a land bridge from Russia to Crimea to secure regular water and power supplies, something which had been a real problem. Whether Russia can now achieve its new and more limited aims still remains a question. In quantities of weaponry and available manpower, in theory, they heavily outnumber the Ukrainians. But with depleted troops, a high casualty rate and low levels of morale, do they really have the resources to secure a victory? They may be regrouping and rearming now, but so are the Ukrainians. The battle to come in the Donbass, warned the Ukrainian foreign minister last week, will be like World War II, with thousands of tanks, armoured vehicles, planes and artillery involved, and doubtless terrible bloodshed. The speculation is that Mr. Putin would like to declare victory in time for May the 9th, Russia's annual anniversary to celebrate victory over the Nazis. He has good reason not to let this war play out long, given the pressures on Russia from without and within. For let's remember, this conflict will not only be decided on the battlefield. Just as important is how the outside world is reacting and what is happening inside Russia. In the outside world, the diplomatic picture is not straightforward. Western democracies may be united in their outrage at what Russia has done, and in the UN General Assembly, Ukraine will be cheered that the votes have gone heavily against Russia. But from Moscow's point of view, the overall picture is not discouraging. Quite a few big global powers voted with Russia, or at least abstained. Among them, China, India, Pakistan, Indonesia, Egypt, South Africa, Mexico, Brazil. That's a lot of very big countries. For years, Mr. Putin has been saying the West is no longer in ascendancy and no longer able to command support of its former colonies. He'll see the lineup of votes at the UN as evidence that emerging powers are no longer prepared to follow Washington and Europe's leads. So while Western sanctions are clearly hitting Russia hard, and Western businesses have en masse withdrawn from the Russian market, Mr. Putin will insist that Russia can weather this storm with help from China and other workarounds, which will allow Russia to continue to sell its oil and gas to alternative customers. He will say that for years Russia has been trying to increase its self-sufficiency and diversify its export business away from almost total reliance on the European energy market. This will just hasten the process. He claims Russia will emerge the stronger from it. But is that true? The question at the heart of this is, if Russians have to tighten their belts amid soaring prices and rising unemployment, will they blame the West for wielding sanctions as a weapon to hit Russian consumers and rally round Mr. Putin even more? Or will they turn their anger on their own government and president for leading them into a war which they never asked for and which is exacting too high a price? And that brings us to the all-important question of how ordinary Russians are reacting to this war. One of the biggest shocks for me, and I think for many external observers of Russia, has been the apparent effectiveness of Mr. Putin's propaganda campaign to convince the Russian people that what's going on in Ukraine is a special operation, that Russia's mission is humanitarian, to protect Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine, and that any claims of Russian atrocities are based on deliberate fabrications to mask the brutality of Ukrainian forces against their own citizens. It's a mind-boggling, cynical inversion of the truth. And what is particularly disturbing is the number of Russians who, on the surface at least, appear to buy into this official Russian narrative. I have found that many expatriate Russians and Ukrainians living in this country have been deeply distressed to find, when they call home, that their own family members and friends in Russia don't believe them when they try to explain what's happening in Ukraine. Instead, their parents and aunts and uncles repeat the official Kremlin line and tell them they must have been brainwashed by Ukrainian and Western propaganda. Even Ukrainians standing in the bombed-out streets of Mariupol or Kharkiv, who phoned back to Russia, have found that their relatives there refuse to accept what they're being told or the pictures that they send them on their iPhones. So how has this come about? Well, certainly there's been a drip of hostile reportage against Ukraine and the West on Russian TV for the last 10 or 15 years to prepare the ground. And in the last few weeks, that hostility has intensified. The information space now in Russia is almost 100% dominated by government-controlled outlets. Not just TV, where most people get their news, also newspapers, and to some extent online. It's an overpowering drumbeat of news, opinion, and debate to ram home the message that if tensions are rising, that's NATO's fault. If there's any violence in Ukraine, it's caused by the Ukrainians themselves. Nowadays, even minor individual expressions of dissent are stifled and stopped. Even holding up a blank sheet of paper in a city square has been treated as an act of defiance and the protester bundled off by the police. Even scrolling through social media sites on your iPhone can get you into trouble. Reports from Moscow say police have taken to stopping people on the street to check their social media history. It's a level of intimidation and control not seen in Russia for decades. As a result, many of those Russians opposed to what's happening have already left the country or are making plans to leave. Hundreds of thousands of Russia's best educated and best informed, mostly young people, the most dynamic part of its society and economy, the key to its future, they've gone, and more will follow, and who knows for how long. As for Mr. Putin, far from trying to stop this exodus, he says he wants Russia to, and I quote, spit out its scum and traitors like spitting out a midge that accidentally flies into your mouth. He actually said that a week or two ago. He wants them gone, so the only people left in Russia will be true patriots. So where does this leave Russia? Well, I think we still have to remain cautious about how many people really do buy the official Kremlin line. There may be some who are simply too afraid to say anything out of line, especially if they're talking on an international phone line to a son or daughter in England. I suspect there are quite a few who are reverting to the old Soviet habit of expressing loyalty in public and keeping their misgivings to themselves. Going into internal emigration is how people in Russia put it. Keep your head down and your mouth shut to avoid trouble. And then there are probably quite a few who simply find it easier not to question what they're being told because it would be too painful to admit that your own country had started a senseless war and your own political leaders were telling terrible lies to cover up their part in horrific war crimes. But for how long will Russians want to stand by their government if the reality of what is happening in Ukraine begins to filter through? There are some rumours which suggest there is beneath the surface already considerable unease in Russia, though it's hard to know how widespread it is. There have been petitions to stop the war from some members of the cultural and academic community. A handful of politicians, including a few parliamentary deputies and 2 former deputy prime ministers, have spoken out. There have been coded messages from some Russian enterprises calling for the alleged massacres in Ukraine to be properly investigated, without actually saying who's to blame. And within the echelons of government, there are reports of some senior officials being put under house arrest. There was a rumour that the governor of the central bank tried to resign but was not allowed to. There was a rumour that the defence minister might have suffered a heart attack, though he seems to have recovered, appearing a couple of times on television. And on social media, there are some posts which appear to give hints of discontent at the grassroots level. A surreptitious film of soldiers' mothers in Siberia berating a local governor and demanding to know what had happened to their sons. An iPhone recording of angry young conscripts in a military vehicle appealing for help and complaining they'd been thrown into Russia's fight like cannon fodder. Are these glimpses evidence of a widespread malaise which could grow if the war goes on much longer? The Kremlin must be well aware of the corrosive effect the Soviet war in Afghanistan had on the Russian population in the 1980s. It was a significant factor in the mounting public anger against the Soviet authorities, which eventually led to the Soviet Union's demise. It's hard to feel much optimism about the immediate future in this part of the world. We all watch with dread to see what the next few weeks will bring. We know there will be more anguish and misery and death to come because the war is not over. And as far as we can tell, the next phase could be more vicious still. But in this Easter week, where we remember sacrifice and suffering, and also celebrate the possibility of redemption and rebirth, I would like to reach for a note of hope, drawn from my own experience of the end of the Soviet Union. Whatever happens on the battlefield, there is a chance that this terrible crisis will, in the end, create the conditions for something better to emerge. In Ukraine, it will be a nation which is stronger, more sure of itself, and which can rebuild to create a better country. And in Russia, too, there is a chance that this ill-advised adventure could provide an opportunity. As I said earlier, many of us who were there found that the reforms which opened up the Soviet Union in the 1980s came as a revelation. Many of us thought the Soviet Communist Party had too firm a grip on power to be dislodged, and the Soviet people were too subservient and cowed to change the system from within. But when the lid was lifted, it was as though the whole country woke up, threw off the shackles of their fear, and seized the chance to have a say in their future. Authoritarian states have a way of collapsing suddenly, and it's only when Russia gets a new leader that its neighbours will have a chance of feeling safe. Maybe, just maybe, this crisis will prove to be a risk too far for Vladimir Putin, and one way or another, it will bring his presidency to an end. And that might provide a new chance for Russia to put itself and its neighbourhood back onto a better path. Thank you.
Well, Bridget, thank you so much. That was wonderful. And you have given us so much insight into particularly the Russian side, because we're so bombarded with the Ukrainian story that to hear the insights from inside Russia have been enormously insightful. Thank you. I hadn't realised it till preparing today, but I visited Russia when you were correspondent there on a number of occasions in the early 90s. I was then working with an organisation called Scripture Union, and I was asked to go because things were opening up and the church was wanting to re-establish working with children and young people. And I was invited to go and to start meeting Russian Christians, first in Moscow, then in St. Petersburg, and then to the capital of Siberia, to Novosibirsk. It was a small number of visits. One of the things that I remember on the first visit to Moscow was being shown round by a young Russian man around the Kremlin. And we got to the centre of the Kremlin and we stood in front of a building, and he stood there and he just pointed at it and he said to me, and I can't remember the exact order, Catherine the Great, Alexander I, Peter I, Lenin, Stalin, Brezhnev, Yeltsin. And he simply looked at me and said, "Does anything change?" And one of the privileges of those visits was that I always stayed with Russian families in their ordinary flats, in their great big high-rises, and so on. And I queued for food with them. So insights into what their ordinary life was. And one of the shocks for me of that was that young man took me to meet his parents, who spent the entire evening with me with no Russian and them with no English, using him as an interpreter, telling me the wonders of Stalin and why everything would be right if only they'd go back to Stalin. It was an enormous privilege for me, and it led to training young Christian leaders from those different parts of Russia, and those are contacts that I still have with my wife. So we have been privileged to be getting little snippets of stories from inside Ukraine, from what's happening in village life and town life and city life, and the extraordinary courage of simply the ordinary citizens who are protecting one another, supporting one another, helping one another. Hearing though from our friends in Novosibirsk, who have contacts with the West, and so they say, we hear and we believe what you are being told. But there is almost no one in our city that we can talk to, because they all believe that our president is in the right. So thank you for all your insights. One of the things that so my second task is to set the questions off. I think the questions are going to range across a very wide range of topics, given the breadth of what you've said. One of the things as a church leader that has disturbed me, and I know many other church leaders, has been the role of Patriarch Kirill and the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church in apparently simply seeking to arm President Putin with a view that this is all right, and as a church leader take it. So I wonder if you could comment on the role of the Russian Orthodox Church a little more fully. You noted the history and how deep that is. And then, quite understandably, you were reflecting on Russia and Ukraine, but I wonder if you would have the courage with us to reflect a little on how you see the UK's response to what has happened. So with huge thanks, Bridget, over to you, and then over to audience.
Thank you very much for your words and your comments. And, well, I think you and I have both had the same impression from our Russian friends, that it's people who share Western criticism of what's happening in Ukraine can feel quite lonely in Russia these days. When so many people are leaving because they don't see any point in staying, or they're scared to stay, it's depressing. But as I said in my talk, I don't know if that's going to stay the way it is. Let's remember what happened in the Afghan War, Soviet-Afghan War. To your questions, religion. I have to say, maybe this is a general point about a country like Russia, which is where all the power and the riches tend to sort of make their way to Moscow or big cities. And in the smaller, out-of-the-way places, they have nothing. I mean, I feel blessed that one of my early experiences was to live in a provincial town in the mid-1970s, which was right at the bottom of the distribution list. So we had very little. I mean, it sounds odd to hear it, but in a town of 1 million people, there was no meat. You couldn't get citrus fruits. You couldn't get washing powder. Life was barren. So I've always known that about Russia, that there's a huge difference between what went on at the top and the bottom. And it's one of the reasons that throughout my life as a correspondent, when going back to Russia, I was always seeking every opportunity I could, reporting for the Today programme or Newsnight, to go to out-of-the-way places, to find out what was happening there in comparison to the oligarchs in Moscow, and to remind people in the West that there was another Russia, which was a very poor Russia. Those are people who watch television every night, and that's their news, that's their information, and they believe what they see. But sometimes things filter through too. Propaganda only works when it feels as though it resonates with what you believe is true in your real life. And if at the same time you're hearing about Masha down the road whose son was killed in Ukraine or has come back with no legs, you're going to start to question what you see on television. But what I wanted to say was that some of the most spiritual people I've met in my life have been local priests in small Russian villages. They were almost saintly people. They had so little, those villages. And these were people who were profoundly religious. And I think when the Soviet Union fell apart, religion played an enormous part, certainly for Russians, in rediscovering their identity. And often at that local level, it was a wonderful thing to see. And the churches moved in when people's houses burnt down or other things didn't work. There was no social safety net, as I said, but the church would often move in and rebuild people's houses for them. So the church in Russia in the last several decades has played a very important role, and sometimes a very positive role. Which is why it's all the more distressing to see that at the top of the church hierarchy, the patriarch and those around him have taken on this very political role in supporting the presidency, and particularly in this war. I can rationally understand what's happening here. Number one, as I said, it's all about Kiev, which was the cradle of Russian Orthodoxy. If you want, Patriarch Kirill would like Santa Sofia back. The Russian Orthodox, the Russian Patriarch, this was part of his flock during the Soviet Union, those who are part of the Orthodox faith rather than the Ukrainian Unionist Church, they all were part of his constituency. And one of the things that has happened since Ukraine became an independent country and tensions have worsened is that part of that flock has been lost, and more of it may be lost because there has been a schism, a historical schism actually, in the Orthodox Church, which has meant that many of those parishes in Ukraine have been given the opportunity to join the Patriarch in Constantinople. I'm sure that rankles with the Patriarch too. And there is the cultural way that Russia talks about war. It's always about a holy war. To be holy warriors, to defend Mother Russia. There's a sort of confluence of nationalism and religion, which comes out of the fact that the beginning of Russian history was seen as the beginning of its religion. But that doesn't mean that, that might be why one could understand, one can rationalize why the Patriarch would have taken such a political role. and see this as something that he should do. But it is the case that there has, not for the first time in Russia, the president has reached for the church to bolster him, to win over the faithful for political reasons. Stalin did it in the Second World War. When the Bolsheviks came in, they were tearing down churches and shooting priests. Churches were turned into prisons and warehouses and abandoned. Then the Second World War, Hitler turns around and begins to invade Russia, and Stalin understands that he needs to galvanize the population to support him. He reaches for the church. And on that occasion, the Russian Orthodox hierarchy came to the state's aid and rallied the people of Russia against the greater evil of Hitler. This time, they're rallying the people of Russia against Ukraine. It's a slightly different calculation and equation. So that's some of the history. There's the hierarchy taking a very political role, supporting the presidency, perhaps not for the best of reasons. I'm sure there are still lots of wonderful Russian believers and priests who, if they knew what was happening, they would be thinking very different things, and perhaps lots of them are now, if they can understand what's going on. The UK's response. So I think the Ukrainian government would say the UK has been very helpful and supportive militarily and politically. Boris Johnson was just in Kiev. Of course, this is a great opportunity for us not to think about Partygate. But I think they feel that in terms of giving moral and political and military support, Britain has been a good ally. I think what many of us feel is, well, how's our government stepped up to the plate in making it possible for refugees to come here? When you look at how many have gone to Poland or little Moldova, who can barely cope, Romania, and you look at the numbers coming here, you think, surely we could do better than that. We know there are bureaucratic problems. I know people who have written in and said they want to open their doors, their spare bedrooms, to Ukrainian families, give them support, somewhere to be, but also love and care, and they're still waiting for an answer from the Home Office. Bridget Kendall has apologised for the slow process of visas, but I think many people share frustration that we would like to be able to do more and quicker. So let's hope the bureaucracy speeds up and makes it possible.
Thank you. We now have an opportunity for questions from the floor, and questions are flowing in quite nicely. If you're using the code that Simon shared with you earlier, you can look at the questions that are being sent in, and you can hope to get them higher up the ranking. So let's start with this first one, which is what peace deal might be reached that would be acceptable to Putin?
Okay, so I think the negotiators on his behalf have, well, they started by saying they wanted Ukraine to be demilitarized. They're now claiming they have demilitarized Ukraine, and that's why they don't need to attack Kiev anymore but can concentrate on the Donbass. I don't think most of us believe that, certainly not when we look at what's happening on the ground. So they can change their rhetoric. I don't think they're looking anymore to get rid of Zelensky. They would like Ukraine to be in some way neutral. What they were talking about in the peace talks in Istanbul till they were put on hold when all the atrocities north of Kiev came to light was some sort of neutral status but with guarantees. So Ukraine wants some kind of guarantee to protect it from Russian tanks rolling across its borders again. They hadn't got very far on that one, but it did feel as though at that point the Ukrainian president was willing to talk about it, not join NATO, but have some kind of protection short of that. I don't know if he feels the same now. Two things have changed. One is the degree of the brutality and death which was left in the wake of the Russian troops withdrawing from eastern Ukraine, and also a sense, I think, in Ukraine that they've done better than they thought they would. Now, that may change. We're in the middle of this conflict. Conflicts are unpredictable. Chapter 2 may end differently. We don't know how well the Russians will do, what their plan is, whether they'll get their act together. And that will change, maybe, the calculation on both sides. I think the Russians they will certainly want to try and take and keep the territory they've got. That's why I indicated that. You could see, practically speaking, this is why they're trying to get Mariupol. They want a land bridge straight from Russia to Crimea, because Crimea up till now has relied for its water, and I think most of its electricity from Ukraine, so the Ukrainians simply turn the taps off. The Russians need to have that land bridge to make it possible to supply Crimea easily. It's basically arid rock. You need to have water source to come in. They have built a bridge across the bottom of the Sea of Azov, but I think it's quite unstable. The water there the currents are very fierce. So that's a practical thing that Russia needs, and it will push for if it can. Hasn't yet got all the territory, but that's what it'd like to do. I think there's a more punitive aspect to this, I suspect, that they would like to take as much of the seacoast as they can, so that Ukraine becomes a hobbled country with almost no external borders, friendly borders, except to the west. And without its ports, exporting its grain would be difficult. So you deplete Ukraine, you make it harder for it to be a successful country, for reasons I explained. Putin doesn't want Ukraine to succeed. Would he cede territory? Would he pull back his troops? Well, the only reason I could think he might do that was if it felt like it was impossible to hold it, because local resistance was so great that too many Russians were getting killed. Or there's pressure at home, amounts to the same thing. The cost is too high. We're not there yet. I think what sort of peace deal that might come out of this, already we're seeing the Russians have been willing to shift the borders of what they say they want to achieve. And whether or not they'll shift them further will depend on what happens in the next few weeks. There is a time factor. If he wants to have it all done by Victory Day, then he may have to think quite hard about what he's prepared to go for. But there are a lot of uncertainties yet, so I'm not sure.
Thank you. You mentioned in passing there that one of the original aims was quite clearly to decapitate the government, both figuratively and literally, with the attempted assassination of President Zelensky. How significant do you think his role in the war so far has been? Do you think Putin simply underestimated him?
Yes, I think he did. Before the war, President Zelensky's popularity was not that high. There's lots of frustration in Ukraine on several levels: economic, corruption, a state not functioning very well. And, the war in the East still continuing. He'd hoped when he came to the presidency that he could sort it out. It didn't happen. I think it's possible that one of the intelligence failures that the Russians had was that they looked at opinion polling or did some sort of focus groups of their own and came to the conclusion that Zelensky wasn't popular. People in Ukraine were very dissatisfied with their government, and that meant that if they could come in on a special operation and simply remove him and put in there an alternative person, that the Ukrainians would be fine with that because they hadn't liked Zelensky. Well, of course, that's not how people behave in one way in peacetime, but in a completely different way when the tanks start rolling into your country. So you'd have thought the Russians could have understood that. But it's also the case that Zelensky has turned out to be a very good wartime leader for Ukraine in this situation. And interestingly, one of the reasons why he is so effective, I've always thought he was an extraordinarily... He made the transition from his old role as actor to politician and leader in a very impressive way, I always thought. But what he's understood is that an awful lot about modern politics, and actually about modern warfare, is about communication. The information warfare, the information battle in this war is absolutely critical. As I've said, the fact that Putin has managed to win over the Russian people, most of them it seems, is astonishing, and he may not have done so well on the battlefield, but so far he's done incredibly well in propaganda terms in Russia. But President Zelensky has done incredibly well in Ukraine, in being a force of moral courage for his own people. You remember that phrase when, I think it was the Americans said, "Would you like us to help you evacuate?" And he said, "I don't need a train, I need ammunition," or something like that. "I don't need a ride, I need ammunition." He wasn't going to leave Ukraine. And then, when there were rumours that he had been captured or killed, he went out on the streets with his iPhone and did some little video shots, selfie. And why was that effective? He's a trained actor. He's good at this stuff. It isn't only that he knows how to give a speech impromptu. He knows, I know about this because after all it was my job, he knows how to do a little film. And it's very powerful. It's very powerful in galvanizing the Ukrainians. He's been incredibly powerful in reminding the rest of the world about Ukraine and what's going on. I think every single day, practically, he's spoken to another parliament in another country around the world. He's done an extraordinary job, and he has used what he is good at to very good advantage. So, A, he's a good performer and knows how to do it, but B, he also, or his advisors, knew that this was a very effective way of keeping our attention on the story and thereby our politicians' attention and giving Ukraine the support it needed. I should say, as a caveat, that a lot of what I believe is happening in Ukraine, I feel quite strongly about because it's being reported on by my former colleagues, and I know them well, and I know I believe them, and that they would only report what they see. And other things, little snippets that I see on YouTube or Twitter, I look at the original Russian, I watch it several times to try and work out if I think it's genuine or not. So I feel I have a sense of what I know. But of course I don't know what I don't know. None of us do. We don't know how many Ukrainian soldiers have been captured, how many are killed. We're being given a filtered view from the Ukrainian side, and that is part, of course, of what President Zelensky is doing too. Him and his communication team is giving us not exactly an over-rosy view of what is happening on the Ukrainian side, but we know it's a filtered view. So we should all be aware of that too. But that's part of him doing his job well.
Thank you so much. So questions have come in about Vladimir Putin, and you talked about the occasions when you interviewed him. And so one question is around what's he like as a character, what was it like to be in the room with him? Is there anything of what we would call toxic masculinity about him? And then the second area is about, well, what happens if there is that general uprising that might happen very suddenly? And I think you described that really well, how in these very oppressive regimes where there's tight control on media, sometimes things can actually turn away very quickly. Is there any alternative to Putin?
Okay, what's Mr. Putin like? I interviewed him twice, once in 2001 when he'd been in office a year, and then 5 years later in 2006. So the first time, he still hadn't really found his feet. This is a man who'd never been elected. He'd never been in a public position before. He'd always been in the back, in the shadows, a wheeler dealer. Even when he was in the government in St. Petersburg, he was the number 2. He wasn't the number 1. He didn't appear on camera that much. He didn't give speeches much. And suddenly here he was, the president. And the interview I did was part of the Kremlin communications team's aim to make him better known. And they thought an international interview with the BBC, broadcast globally, in fact we did it on the internet initially. They said, no, we can't put it out live on television. Television is a nuclear bomb. What happens if a glass of water spills? No, you have to do it recorded. They had in those, after all, it was a long time ago, 2001, they thought the internet and television were rather different. I don't think now anyone would think there's any difference between them. But I do remember when he first came into the room, when we were getting ready to do the interview, no one kind of noticed he came in. He had no charisma or aura whatsoever. He's quite short and rather retiring in the way he behaves. And I think he wasn't yet comfortable in his own position as president. head of state, and I think those around him hadn't yet quite got the measure of him either. And when we did the interview, I felt afterwards, I felt by the end of it, that it was almost as though there were two Mr. Putins. So if I asked him questions about security, about nuclear weapons, about the Chechen war, he was very fluent and quite aggressive and was quite sure about what he wanted to say. I mean, one of the questions I asked, which is sort of a relevant parallel to today, was how do you think you can get away with pounding Chechnya in the way you are and destroying Grozny? The Chechens will hate you for decades, the Russians. And he said, no, I don't think they will. They'll soon come round. And I said, well, I've just come back from the refugee camps on the border, and I can tell you they all hate the Russians. And he just went, what an impudent question. So presumably that's what he thinks about Ukraine now. You know, if people were to say, well, how can you hit Ukraine? These will, your blood brothers, they will be your enemies forever. And he will say, no, they won't. And if you disagree with him, he'll say, impudent question. So that was the same Mr. Putin then as now. But I also asked him quite a lot of personal questions because we didn't know very much about him in those days. The catchphrase in Russia was, "Kto Putin?" Who is Mr. Putin? So I asked him what he was reading. And I asked him a little bit about his family. The questions are quite revealing, and I think one of the reasons that they were revealing was because he didn't quite yet know how to answer that sort of thing. What was he reading? Biographies of Catherine the Great, Empress Catherine, and Peter the Great. So that's where his mind was right from the beginning of his presidency, so that was quite telling. On his family, we had a question from a young man from St. Petersburg, which I asked on his behalf, which was, so who wears the trousers in your marriage? I mean, you know, you think now, how could I have asked that question of Mr. Putin? But, I thought I'd ask it because I wanted to see how he'd reply, and he took it completely seriously. He didn't say, what an impudent question. He said, well, you know, she doesn't get involved in my job and I don't get involved in hers. She kind of rules the roost at home. They did get divorced a few years later, let's remember. So, but it showed a different Mr. Putin. So I felt that on the one hand there was this slightly retiring, not very comfortable new politician who wasn't quite sure how to handle a big interview. And on the other hand, when he was in his comfort zone of security and foreign policy, he absolutely knew where he was and what he thought and where he wanted to, how he wanted to retaliate. 5 years later, in 2006, by which time oil prices had gone sky high, Russia was beginning to pay off its foreign debt, he was about to host a G8 summit for the first time, and his popularity had soared because they had the money in the coffers to increase pensions and teachers' salaries and things. A very different scenario. It was the same studio, the same format, but instead of there being two Mr. Putins, there was just the first Mr. Putin, just the aggressive Mr. Putin. And what was that phrase? Toxic masculinity. Absolutely. A little anecdote. The Russians had decided that they would invite Russian people to put in questions and vote on which they thought were the best questions. And we said at the BBC we weren't going to do that because we found these tended to be hijacked by diasporas, and before you knew it, the Tamil diaspora or the Eritrean diaspora had sort of masterminded a vote around a certain question, and it was not representative, so we weren't going to do that. And I remember they said, you're not being very democratic, we're going to be much more democratic in Russia. But they ruled the day because the top question which most people voted for, this is 2006, was, dear Mr. Putin, when are you going to legalize marijuana? Which I think tells you that most people using the internet in Russia in 2006 were probably aged about 18. The second question, also from some teenage jokers, I think, was, so when are you going to bring in robots to man our borders? Because they're far too long for us to have enough border guards. Which is not a stupid question, actually. Russia has very long borders. And then the third question, which people voted as being an appropriate question to ask their president, was, when did you first have sex? So the day before the interview, we had a meeting with his communication director, and they were very worried about this, and they said, we've been hijacked, and we said, well, we told you. And we left it at that. And then we did the interview. there were Russian journalists asking the Russian questions, they didn't ask these questions, and I asked my questions. And at the very end, we had a meeting with Mr. Putin and the Kremlin lobby, the lobby journalists like the Downing Street lobby who follow the president around. And they asked him what he thought about the interview, and he said he thought it had gone very well. And then some bright spark said, and what did you think about the questions that were the most popular on the internet? And all his staff went, whoo, in a great intake of breath. But he, having, I think, no sense of humour, took it completely literally and said, well, I don't think I'm going to legalise marijuana. And as for robots on the border, well, we are thinking of investing in some drones. Good answer. That's what you need. And then the journalist said, and what did you think about the third question, Mr. President, the one about when you first had sex? So we're all waiting for his answer. And he leans back in his chair, mansplaining, with his legs apart, and sort of looks at me, and then he says, well, I don't remember the first time I had sex, but I remember the last time down to the last second. Toxic masculinity. I think that proves it, doesn't it?
The second part of that might then move on to, if not Putin,
then who? I think it's a very hard one to answer now. When I've talked about Russia in the past, I used for a long time to think that Dmitry Medvedev, who was president for 4 years when he stepped aside between 2008 and 2012, and then became prime minister again. The Russians used to call it castling, when you put the king and the rook and swap them. That maybe they would just swap again. In fact, there was a Russian joke about that. But he seems to be very tainted now. The Russian opposition activist Navalny produced a film showing how very corrupt he was and had amassed lots of riches, and his star seems to have fallen. He has spoken up more in the last few weeks over the events in Ukraine. My reasoning was that if Mr. Putin somehow were to disappear, many Russians would find that very terrifying, because they always feel we need a strong leader in order to hold this huge country together. And they remember the collapse of the Soviet Union and the terrible chaos after that I alluded to. And I think that, on balance, I thought people would find it very reassuring to have someone there who is both new but not new. So Medvedev would be more of the same but new, and so that might be quite a good transitional character. I think that's still a possibility if his elite around him wanted to somehow think, how do we reassure people while we decide what to do next, that he could be a sort of stopgap who people would feel, oh, well, that's all right, then we kind of know him. But he is now very weakened. I also used to think that the defense minister was a possibility, Shoigu. He'd been around in the Russian government since the collapse of the Soviet Union. He was President Yeltsin's first emergencies minister, and a very effective one. Whenever there was a mudslide or a river flood, he would always be on a plane and out there helping the villagers. And he was very popular for that, and he seemed to be a kind of can-do guy and not very ideological. He has always said, I couldn't possibly be any kind of leader for Russia because I'm not even a Russian. He's a Tuvan, which is a small republic, Tuvan Republic in Siberia. But he's clearly very close to Mr. Putin. You kind of know when people are close because they are filmed having tea with him on his summer break. It used to be Medvedev, and then it became Shoigu. And I thought, see, I'm right. It might be Mr. Shoigu. But of course, he's now very implicated in this latest conflict. And as I said, there was a rumour that Putin had a shouting match with him about how badly the start of the war had gone, and he'd ended up with a heart attack in hospital. So, I don't know what's going on there. I think it's becoming really very hard to tell what's going on at the top, and how the cards are shuffling, and how people are lining up, who is really prepared to be behind the president on this, who's got misgivings, who would have the political skill to navigate what must be a hornet's nest at the moment. And a lot would depend on how Mr. Putin were to go, if he were to go. So I find myself less able to come up with names than I used to now. I think we're in very unpredictable territory.
Well, Bridget, you've been on your feet for close to an hour and a half, so I think you'll be relieved that that's the end of the questions, even though we've had a mountain of questions that we could keep going on for another few hours. So it does fall to me, on behalf of everybody here, to thank you for this extraordinary evening, where you brought to bear your own experience, your own insight, your own intelligence into what's been going on, not just in the recent months, but looking back and interpreting that for us. So we're hugely grateful to you. Thank you so much for your presence and insight this evening. Please do join me in showing our leave the cathedral today. We've been working on a project with Durham Cathedral Institute to relight the cathedral, so hopefully it's in blue and yellow as you go out. This is one of many events during Holy Week. Do look up on our website. Tomorrow evening we have St John Passion, and then on Wednesday night Professor Maggie Dawn is speaking as part of our service of confidence. There are many other events, but thank you so much for your participation this evening. Safe journey home, and let's give a final round of applause.